Hello YouTube. The Emperors of Tamriel are a focal point of discussion online, from the well-liked Uriel Septim VII to the Mad Emperor Pelagius Septim III, to the most recent Emperor by the time of Skyrim, Titus Mede II. Each have their own legacy and reputation, and all are pretty well known in the lore community. Now, today, as a bonus video before I finally release my video on the bugs and insects from Tamriel, which takes a lot more time than I thought it would, I specifically wanted to take a look at some of the more obscure emperors most people might not really know about, but who did rule Tamriel, or at least parts of it during their time. So, that having been said, let's roll the intro and talk about some emperors. Alright, so as a general rule for this video, I will specifically not talk about any of the emperors of documented dynasties, or rather well-documented dynasties, or emperors who feature heavily in some of the mainline games, specifically because those emperors are not obscure. They generally have pretty substantial stories, and chances are that I have covered them in the past on this channel. So if you want to know more about some interesting non-obscure emperors, I'll recommend some videos for you to watch at the end of this video. That having been said, I specifically said well-documented dynasties, because I think it's worth taking a look at some of the emperors of the earliest Cyrodiilic Empire, the Alessian Empire, which held Cyrodiil for more than 1,000 years during the First Era. You see, while the Riemann Emperors, the Septim Emperors, the Longhouse Emperors and even the Mede Emperors to some degree have been pretty well documented, or at least most people are aware of them. That isn't really the case for the Alessian Emperors, as documentation on the Alessian Emperors is generally quite sparse. You see, like I said, the Empire lasted for well over 1,000 years, and yet we only know 7 emperors by name, and 2 of those are the first 2 leaders of the Empire, Alessia, the founder, and her son, Belharza the Man-Bull, the only known Minotaur Emperor, both of whom have pretty substantial stories and are not that obscure. Most people know about them, and I covered Belharza on the channel before. But it's after them that the histories get quite muddled. You see, there's about a 40-year gap or so between the suspected death of Emperor Belharza and the first documented activities of the next emperor, a man named Amiel, who was emperor of the Alessian Empire in a time of turmoil, and from what we know, he was either a quite weak ruler or quite incompetent, or his enemies were really strong, as he allowed the religious sect called the Alessian Order to gain massive amounts of influence in the empire until they were able to literally undertake a coup, leaving the emperor as a mere figurehead of the empire, while the sect held the real power. Now, this religious sect, the Alessian Order, very simplified, did 2 things. 1, hate elves and all other non-humans. 2, reject all gods except for the One, which was essentially a more complicated version of Akatosh, and likely due to their actions with this whole god thing, they eventually ended up destroying time for 1,000 years. Trust me, it's far more complicated than that, but that's what you need to know for this video. Anyway, with this order at the helm of the empire, there were quite a lot of persecutions during Amiel's reign, with even allied elite elven city-states who had allied with the humans at the time of the empire's founding with Alessia. Even they suffered pogroms at the hand of the order in the name of this emperor Amiel. Now, other than that, we don't know a whole lot about Amiel, and neither do we really know that much about the other emperors of the Alessian Empire, like Emperor Gorius. We only really know that his coronation was pretty tense, since, just like Amiel, he was under the thumb of the Alessian Order, who of course really hated elves and all other non-human races. Meanwhile, despite that, representatives of elvish and other non-human states actually attended his coronation for diplomatic reasons, making the whole occasion pretty tense. That's really all we know about him, except for the fact that under his rule, the Alessian Empire also suffered some pretty bad military defeats, which according to some in-universe historians is what actually signaled the beginning of the Empire's decline. Now, during this period of decline, we really only know of 2 other significant emperors, or should I say empresses, because one is Empress Herda, who we really don't know anything about other than her apparently being a bit more diplomatic than her predecessors. And we also know of Empress Hestra, whom we do know quite some things about, mostly her dealing with problems in the Empire. For one, she tried to fix the Empire's bad infrastructure. Then she had to face the Grey Host, an army of vampires, werewolves and other terrors around the year 1000 of the First Era, whom she managed to defeat. And then she also was the one who incorporated parts of High Rock and the Reach into the Empire, with her forces in the Reach being harrowed by rebel Reachmen forces of the legendary Red Eagle, who most people actually know about by now because of his featuring in both the Elder Scrolls Online and in Skyrim. And finally, in the south of the continent, Empress Hestra's armies actually faced the legendary pirate king Red Bremen. A pretty busy rule altogether, although also rife with problems. Now, at some point, likely after Empress Hestra, or perhaps a bit before her, there was an emperor named Shor-El who ruled the Alessian Empire. We really know nothing about him. We only know that he existed because of the book Where Were You When the Dragon Broke? That book actually mentions him as being one of the emperors of the Alessian Empire, whose soul is stored in the Amulet of Kings. When he reigned, what he was like, we really have no idea, we only have the name. That being said, those were basically the obscure emperors that we know of the Alessian Empire, but there's one more honorable mention here. You see, during the time of Alessian Belharza, in the First Era, there was another emperor on Tamriel, specifically the Emperor of Elsewhere, an unnamed Khajiit Moon Emperor. Now, we know quite a bit about the warlord who overthrew this Moon Emperor, a Khajiit named Darlok Bray, also known as the Golden Beast of Anaquina, who overthrew the Moon Emperor and went on to conquer significant parts of Valenwood, southern Cyrodiil and elsewhere as a warlord. To be fair, this guy is actually really interesting, but yeah, he deserves his own video because he never took on the title of Moon Emperor, so he doesn't really count. That said, we don't really know all that much about the Moon Emperor, or even if there were more of them, so we don't even know if the Moon Emperor that gets mentioned was the first and the last Moon Emperor, or whether or not he was the last of the dynasty and there were ones before him. We really don't know. Perhaps we'll one day learn more. Right now we don't know more than that. Also, I want to give a quick shout out to Toshraka, the emperor of the Kaputun cat people of Akavir, who may have turned himself into a tiger dragon god, but that is Akavir, not Tamriel, so he doesn't count for this video. Also, shout out to the emperors of Yokuda, who I plan to one day give a separate video, but that also isn't Tamriel. So yeah, just mentioning them in case you were wondering where are they. Now, let's get to the real obscure human emperors of Tamriel, those not part of dynasties and those not dragonborns, with most of them essentially being pretender emperors. First of all, let's talk about Emperor Atrabas, the pretender emperor ruling in Cyrodiil after the disintegration of the Riemann Empire. The only real reason that this imperial pretender is recorded in the histories is for what he did. You see, during the time of the Riemann Empire, there were quite some Akaviri living in Cyrodiil, because Riemann Cyrodiil, the first emperor of the Riemann Empire, had an army of Akaviri swear fealty to him during their invasion of Tamriel during his early years. These Akaviri forces mingled in the empire eventually, with the emperor's closest advisor and deputy, or potentate, even being an Akaviri for all the Riemann emperors. With the empire itself, after the death of the last emperor, even being ruled by Akaviri potentates for several centuries. Now, to get back to Atrabas, he is recorded in the histories because he was the warlord who took the Ruby Throne somewhere after the assassination of the last Akaviri potentate, and he then worked hard to get rid of all Akaviri citizens in Cyrodiil, even eventually fully expelling them from the province in order to get rid of Akaviri influence in the Imperial province, leading them to migrate to border regions in Elsewhere, for example. That's all really we know that he did, but it's something very significant because it removed Akaviri influence from Cyrodiil for several years. Now, next up we actually have you, or well, you if you play Elder Scrolls Online and you're actually really good at PvP. Because since that gameplay takes place during an all-out war where 3 factions attempt to conquer Cyrodiil and take the Ruby Throne, it's possible to attain the title of Emperor in the Elder Scrolls Online until some other pretender player takes it from you. There have been hundreds, if not thousands, of these emperors over the years now, and due to the nature of them being in lore self-crowned military leaders whose reign is shorter than a mayfly, sometimes even just minutes, none of them will probably be recorded in actual lore. Though I heard of 1 or 2 people actually holding the title for several months through dedicated play, and I would love it if there were some reference to them in future games, like one guy apparently held the title for more than half a year. That's actually impressive. So I can see them referencing that maybe at some point, but other than that, there's no real lore to be had with these pretenders. Now, that said, the next sort of emperor that we know of was Kulakain, or Kulakain, I never know how to pronounce it. He was a king of Falkreath during the long interregnum in the Second Era, who has essentially come to be known as the Emperor Zero of the Septim Empire, as it were his conquest of Cyrodiil and the Imperial City, which laid the foundations for the conquests undertaken by Tiber Septim, who would start the Septim dynasty. He and his forces ended up taking the Imperial City, but despite his apparent intention to be crowned Emperor of Cyrodiil, he was never crowned, as he was killed by assassins, which then conveniently put General Talos, later known as Tiber Septim, in the position to assume leadership. You might wonder, did Tiber Septim kill him? It's possible, but it's not a certainty, as Tiber Septim himself also got pretty badly wounded during the assassination, and there's several theories about it, such as Reachman having killed him, but we might never find out the truth about who killed him, as if it was Tiber Septim, he and his successors would have likely done everything to cover it up, so we'll never know who killed Emperor Zero, probably. Now, the final obscure emperor that I want to talk about is the Emperor Thules the Gibbering, an emperor who we once more know very little about, but who's quite interesting nonetheless. You see, after the fall of the Septim dynasty and subsequent disintegration of the Septim Empire, after the death of Potentate Okato, just like after the Riemann Empire, we had a period of several years called the Stormcrown Interregnum, in which all sorts of warlords fought over the Ruby Throne. The final one of these petty conquerors to sit on the Imperial throne of Cyrodiil before the new dynasty was the Witch Warrior Emperor Thules the Gibbering, with that nickname likely being given to him by his enemies, because I don't think that's the name that he reigned under. That being said, he didn't really rule a very big empire, while High Rock, Skyrim and Morrowind hadn't officially broken away from the empire at the point of his rule. They did not listen to Imperial authority and there were no legions left in the provinces. During this time, even Cyrodiil had fractured, with Anvil, Kavach and likely Skingrad being part of the Kingdom of Colovia under Titus Mede I, who did not accept Thules' authority and would later conquer the Ruby Throne and depose him. Then you also had Bravil and Leowyn, who straight up declared themselves to be independent city-states and blocked the Empire's trade. So Thules really only had this northern part of Cyrodiil, and likely only for a year or two, as not long into his reign the Elder Council decided to support the King of Colovia, Titus Mede, his claim to the throne, leading to Titus conquering the city with only about 1,000 men and Thules being deposed. Now, while at first the council had favoured Thules over Titus, keeping him in place for a year or two because he was seen as a cultured Nebinese man who brought stability, that quickly changed when Thules the Gibbering apparently showed strange perversions. And Titus Mede was then able to convince the Elder Council and their leader, Hirem, to accept him as the new emperor when he conquered the city, in exchange for them all keeping their positions. So, in the year 17 of the 4th era, Emperor Thules was deposed and a new dynasty was started. The Mede dynasty of the 4th era. And those were some of Tamriel's most obscure emperors, and I sincerely hope that you enjoyed this video and that I managed to teach you something new about the Elder Scrolls universe today. And if you learned something new, why not return for the next Elder Scrolls lore content, probably next week, when I have time. That being said, I promise to recommend some more videos on more prominent emperors that with interesting stories. So if you go to the description you will find links to videos about Emperor Belharza, whom we talked about earlier in the video, Emperor Uriel Septim VII, the emperor featured in most of the pre-Oblivion games, and probably my favorite emperor Brazilus Dor, Tamriel's party emperor. Trust me, the video is worth a watch. That being said, all there's left for me to do is to vocally thank my top Patreon supporters. Mr. Bernardo Binda, His Soul, Gabriel Binda, Doji, K-Legend M, King Chris, Lance Vandertooth, Volker of Argonia, RP the Beast, Devin Mattingly, Rakai, and Sword of Bushido. They and all the others on screen make my videos possible, and for that I am very grateful. That said, I'll see all of you in the next Elder Scrolls lore video. Probably next week. Bye bye.